Hello and welcome to this edition of Table Talk, a series of conversations with writers, academics, scholars, and activists who work on human-animal relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I am Anu Pande, and my co-host is Susan Haris. Our guest tonight is Dominic O'Key from the University of Sheffield, and we are going to be talking to him about his book, Creaturely Forms in Contemporary Literature, Narrating the War Against Animals. Before we start, I would like to mention that this table talk is going to last for about an hour. So please feel free to join in with your questions and comments at any time. Please unmute yourself, raise a hand, or just type your question in the chat box, whichever option suits you. A very warm welcome to you, Dominic. We are delighted to have this opportunity to discuss your work with you. I would like to start by asking you to elaborate on the term war against animals. Is it different from Derrida and Bardivell's use of the term?
Hi, thanks for having me, Anu and Susan. It's wonderful to be talking to you today. And it's a great question to kick off. Well, it's a term which is certainly inspired by Derrida, by, as you say, Dinesh Bardivell, and also a lot of other thinkers who either talk about the war against animals or, sometimes more broadly, in the case of someone like Rachel Carson, she spoke of a war against nature. What I use in the book is a sense of the war against animals as a kind of jumping off point for thinking structurally about the kind of prevailing relations between humans and animals in modernity. There are, of course, numerous ways that humans relate to animals, many non-violent, many caring, many loving. But what we are living through right now is a period of quite dramatic change between human-animal relations, and one which is a history that takes place within what we might call capitalism. And so when I talk about the war against animals, what I'm trying to do is think about how, on the one side, we have a global system of animal production and consumption that takes place in factory farms, in dairy farms, all around the world, that results in increased deforestation and climate change. But on the other side, we have, so we've got on the one side this mass production of animals, and on the other side a mass extinction. The Earth is going through it's not quite there in the scientific consensus, but it's almost there. There is an idea that the Earth is experiencing a sixth great extinction event, basically a profound uprooting of biodiversity or biological diversity. And so when I say the war against animals in this book, what I'm trying to do is understand the conjuncture in which we are living, a conjuncture in which, as I say, on the one hand, we have the mass production of animal bodies, and on the other, the mass extinction of animal bodies. So one for consumption, and the other, those wild animals, which are not yet folded into what capital considers to be worthy of production, instead are left to die as the outcome of the various things which necessitate the production of other animal bodies. So I do certainly engage with Derrida's work, Bardivell's work, Rachel Carson's work, and a few others. But I'm trying, in fact, in the introduction to this book, to take on the kind of historical materialist sense of a war against animals as well. Thank you for the question.
So, as you put it in your introduction also, the mass production, exchange, slaughter, consumption, and extinction of animals has characterized capitalist modernity on the whole. But it's in the decades following the Second World War that it has escalated to a war, really. This is an interesting premise, since it seems to suggest that there was a continuity across species lines as far as violence and war in the 20th century is concerned. But the allusion to capitalist modernity reveals also a distinctly Marxist reading of the socioeconomic conditions in which this mass production and consumption of non-human animals occurs. the war against animals is a capitalist enterprise in that sense. But at the same time, Marxist theory has largely overlooked the way animals are treated under capitalism.
Hmm.
Why do you think does this lacuna exist?
Well, that's a huge question, and one in which even many Marxist thinkers have tried to reckon with in their own work. There are a couple of great books, articles on this very question. There is, for example, a book about 30, 40 years ago came out called Natural Relations by a philosophy professor called Ted Benton. But since then, there have been numerous debates internal to Marxist discourse about why, on the whole, Marxist or Marxian readings haven't attended to animals. I mean, we might say rather simplistically that the enterprise of Marxist thought, at least in its kind of germinal setting, was a critique of capitalism for the sake of human liberation, of social liberation. And so it is quite understandable then why the non-human is not incorporated in that. It is not it might not be a failing that it is focused that way. That is what it did. But Marxism, of course, is not just ossified with the 19th century. Instead, we are continually engaging with it, updating it, developing it, sharpening its tools of critique, and also questioning its own place and history and future. And so, yeah, well, Marxism is also, in a way, it has addressed that lacunae. It has, in various ways. As I said, there was a book about this a few decades back by Ted Benton. But more recently, I think that in the 21st century, as we have this kind of increasing convergence of social struggle and environmental struggle, which is happening out there in the world, which is being organized on the ground, there is, within the kind of intellectual discourse, there is an attempt through numerous kind of flags of particular political persuasion on the left to go to Marxism in order to link these together. And, you know, people like Jason W. Moore, who's doing this work on world ecology, but then more recent people like Troy Vitesse over in the States, who's been publishing like in the New Left Review. These are kind of green-red critiques, right? Green, environmental, red, Marxist, and they may not be contributions to the field of animal studies, right? They might not be specifically written for animal studies scholars, but their tools and their modes of argumentation are either friendly towards animal studies, or can be, in the case of what I'm trying to do in this book, actually bring them to bear on animal studies, and to think, okay, animal studies has this critique of literature, and it has a way, in literary studies, it has a way of reading literature, and Marxism has its own way of reading literature. Can we think of those things together? Is kind of one of the ambits of this book. So yeah, I mean, to put it simply, right? Marxism is a humanism, but that doesn't mean that it's set in stone. And I think that the continual adaptation is precisely what someone like Marx would have wanted anyway. A ruthless self-criticism, right, for the sake of the future.
Thank you. Yes, that was something I had always wondered about, if Marxist critique and Marxist thought had undergone some sort of an animal turn in the last couple of decades at all. So that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned this in your book, of course, in a variety of ways, the role that literature plays in the war against animals. And I wondered what the different ways are in which contemporary literature participates in the war against animals. We see in the case studies that you presented in your book, focusing on the three authors, how they play a progressive role, if you can call it that. But are there also possibilities of participating in the war against animals by being complicit in it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. Yes, the simple answer here is absolutely yes. I think that one of the premises of my book, and that I try to outline in the introduction to allow me to progress towards those, as you say, progressive texts. One of the premises there is that literary works can tell us a great deal about how we live alongside animals. Each literary work which either mentions animals, or maybe animals are kind of conspicuous by their absence. Each literary text, in a sense, registers a particular way of being human, and I think that's not controversial in any way to anyone who works in literary studies. But of course, if it registers something about what it means to be human, then what it means to be human is always in relation to our communities, our lives, our ecologies, our environments. And that means then what it means to be human has something to do with animals too. So I think that, yeah, if we say that literature can tell us something about human-animal relations, then the question becomes, what do those works tell us? And works at particular moments, written in particular times, under particular regimes and conditions, in different places of the world, how do they differ? And do they tell different stories about what it means to be human, and a human who lives alongside animals? Now, what I am trying to do in the book is think about contemporary literature. So as we've said in the past 15 minutes, what is the contemporary? What is our moment? Well, it's a moment of increasing mass production of animals and increasing mass extinction. And so this is a moment which maybe whether kind of literary authors know it or not, right? Whether they are doing so consciously or unconsciously, their works are being produced and published within this moment. And so there is a tangible relation then between there's a tangible relation between these two things, which through the work of criticism, the work of literary criticism, we might tease out how books are engaging or not, right? Or might be complicit, as you say, in this time of animal production and animal death. So I could have, for example, written a few chapters which were critique, right? Which were trying to assess those works which are in fact complicit. And then I could have written a second half of the book which looked at texts which were more progressive, more interventionist, more challenging. The reason I decided to leave that side out is because I didn't want to just write a book that felt like I was negating a series of authorial interventions that may have had their own possibilities. Instead, I wanted to have something that was propositional about this book. It wasn't just a critique of literature. It was instead a critique and elevation, a critique and celebration. So close reading as a way to actually draw out the ways in which literary texts, perhaps, even in ways they didn't foresee, the authors didn't foresee, could not see, or ways in which other critics have not yet seen, how those texts challenge the war against animals in some way, shape, or form. But we might say that the vast majority of literature published in at least the global north and the Anglophone speaking world, the vast majority of this is what I would call anthroponormative, in that it centers the human as the norm of social life, or of life, planetary life even. And that might just be a feature of, for example, the novel or poetry, right? In some way, that these are works written by humans. So of course they're going to be normatively inscribing the human as the central actor. But even though the vast majority might do that, there are numerous works which are not kind of towing that line, are not complicit in that sense, are actually deliberately in some cases trying to write in such a way, to produce literary writing in such a way that doesn't reinscribe the kinds of complicities that have been literarily exercised elsewhere, articulated elsewhere. And it's just through the work of three authors in the book that I try and tease out that three writers who I saw as whose works I see as kind of actually rethinking what it means to write as a author about animals too. So yeah, thank you. It's a brilliant question.
you just said about seeing your project while writing this book as consisting of two parts, a critique and then a proposition of something else, reminds me very much of what you say about Mahashweta Devi's writings also, and her double task, of a critique of development, for example, and then a proposition of a new kind of love, which will possibly mitigate the effects of what has been done to animals and with animals. It's really a beautiful thought.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I was saying that to try and foreground, or at least foreshadow, right, what is also going on at the level of the text itself that I've written. That in the case of Mahashweta Devi, that there is something there about because I see this a lot in literary studies, and I do really enjoy reading those works of scholarship which are there and they exist to critique and leave it at that, and I love that, and I think that, and I do that in other places. But for this first book of mine, I really wanted to try and recuperate the literary as an important social and artistic intervention for thinking about animals. So I could have written a book which was, here are 7 works which toe the line, which are completely complicit and show that they reduplicate that war against animals within literature. But I wanted to go a different path.
Susan, you have a question?
Yeah, I was recently reading Gyan Prakash's essay on subaltern studies, and he begins the essay by saying that Marxism has done a great job of talking about imperialist domination and control, but Marxism is not able to break free of Eurocentric discourses and thereby reproduces the Eurocentric subject. And I was thinking that in relation to what you say about literature and about literature written from different locations. So, and you also talk about Rancière and the redistribution of the sensible and so on. So I guess my question is about what role post-colonial critique plays in thinking about the animal, because I think on one hand, it seems to me that if you're talking about democratization, then you're assuming that the animal is has this creaturely abject state, that the animal is in everywhere across the world. And then post-colonial critique or Mahashweti's work, for example, would be just a different example of that abjection or that creatureliness, would be an example from just a different location. But the whole thing about post-colonial critique is that it is more than just the local against the global. So I had 3 related questions to this, which is one, to talk about the war against animals. Is the assumption that we have to work with that the animal is in a vulnerable, precarious condition everywhere, universally? And my second question is, if the post-colonial critique, if that can be anything more than just a question of the local. And my third question connected to that is, which is the most puzzling for me, is if the conditions of capitalism are such that then the post-colonial just becomes a matter of degree. Under capitalism, I suppose in the West, because of factory farming and stuff, the animal is mass-produced, is subject to slaughter, and therefore perhaps a Marxist critique becomes more useful. Would you agree with that? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, I'm just writing those questions down. I might come back to you to elaborate on the third, or maybe the second, but I can, I've written them down, and I'm thinking them through as I'll say this about the first. You ask whether, if I've understood you right, you ask whether the war against animals as kind of sort of soft methodology for reading the world or reading literature, whether that endorses a understanding of animals as universally precarious. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I hope I convey in the book is that whilst there is something universalizing about the drive to mass produce some animals, which results in the mass extinction of others, while there is a universalizing gesture of the profit machine, essentially, a kind of worldly limits. How far can it stretch? As much as that is still a universalizing gesture, I think we on the other side have to have our own universalizing gestures. Now, of course, I think when we get into the nitty gritty, and we have those case studies in the case of my chapters, I hope that there is a kind of necessary specificity which questions the universality of that as an assumption or a guiding kind of red thread through the book. There is specificity, of course, or it's universally differentiated in that way. But I think that for the sake of a kind of necessary abstraction, in order to make these things analytically intelligible and understandable, then I think that you do have to kind of make some calls, make some decisions around what are the kind of operating concepts which are going to have to be emplaced here, knowing full well that they come up against those kinds of problems of particularity. So yeah, I mean, I try and hopefully have some sort of dialectical relationship with that, right? In the introduction, I try and say that, okay, not all, not every relation between humans and animals is like is a kind of negative one, is an evaluatively negative one. That, as I said at the start of this, that that would discount all of these different ways of humans and animals living together, which are non-violent or loving or caring or whatever. But I think that analytically, it makes a lot of sense for us to say, what is the top layer? What is the dominant, right? To use kind of that Raymond Williams terms of the emergent, the dominant and residual, right? What's the dominant force right now? And I mean, it's clear to me that the stakes are very high if we have such a dramatic loss of biodiversity that's ongoing and predicted. The stakes are so high that maybe those kind of abstract forms of thought are useful, no matter their exclusions. So I hope that answers the first question. Second one and the third one are more specifically about the uses of post-colonial theory and critique. And I mean, the second question is fantastic, and I would want to defer in a way to other readers of the book to know whether I have done justice to the authors that I've worked with in such a way that doesn't just articulate them as a instance of locality in a global story. I hope that's not the case, and I hope that that they all stand in their own way, in their own light, and are not just there for local flavour. I hope that's not the case. But as I say, I think I will leave that up to readers to tell me whether that's happened or not. But your question is kind of, if I've understood it rightly, the question's also getting at the role of post-colonial theory in the book, right? As a methodology, as an approach. And perhaps it's a reflection of my training and my own schooling that post-colonial theory is really here, really present, and yet not a central facet, not a central node of the book. I was doing a PhD at the University of Leeds, which has a really rich history of post-colonial studies scholarship, ongoing, not just a history, but an ongoing conversation and a kind of a great plethora of voices who've contributed a lot to the discourse. So that has definitely fed into this, and I've tried in a way to present that post-coloniality in the author studies themselves. I mean, you know, you might even say that I take a German author, W.G. Sebald, as a post-colonial author in some way, in that his books, his literary works, are often engaging with specific issues related towards colonialism and the era of decolonization. And then finally, you asked about whether the post-colonial setting becomes a matter of degree, or a kind of kind under an umbrella. And I guess what you mean there is there a risk of obscuring what is specific? Is that right? That there is a sense in which if the post-colonial nation or the post-colonial writer is merely, or is not merely, but is articulated within a wider story of capitalism, then is their post-coloniality subsumed? Is that your question?
Yeah, I think I was just thinking if there's a paradox at play. You know, the post-colonial condition has so much currency because, you know, there's subaltern communities in post-colonial nations. But I was wondering if there is a paradox at all, because in the capitalist frame, it seems to be reversed. It is in the Western countries that the animal or animals are generally subject to so much more brutalization than, I suppose, suppose in India, for example. And what that would mean for, you know, do you think that's a paradox at all? And what that would mean for thinking about the post-colonial specificity?
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer the question of whether that's a paradox. That feels like something that I need to go away and seriously reckon with. And but I think you're onto something. I think you're onto something there. What I will say is that that sense of the post-colonial that you've just been talking about, you know, in the third chapter of the book on Mahashweta Devi, you know, one of the arguments that I'm trying to make there is that to take her as one of the paradigmatic authors of what has become post-colonial studies, and if we follow all of that criticism, we might be forgiven for not seeing the ecological or the environmental that is animating her mostly her prose work, in this case, that I look at. And so one of the things that I in fact try to do in that chapter is to say that the subaltern subjects that Mahashweta Devi, you know, seems to have been so committed to, politically committed to, outside of literature, when we get into the space of literature, there is in fact something going on where that political commitment starts to become ecological, that a commitment to human life or social life and social change inside the text, that necessitates a confrontation between human and nature, essentially, because for example, the Adivasi communities that she's writing about are people who are being displaced, historically displaced from land. And so the question of land comes in. And then the question of animals comes in very, very quickly. And so within a level of the text, you can see these links. And I think you get that through post-colonial analysis, but it just so happens that lots of the heretofore humanist post-colonial analysis hasn't made that, not a leap, it's not a leap, but hasn't even seen that connection. So that's what I try and draw out there. And yeah, hopefully then it's not just, you know, the reader can judge this for themselves, but hopefully then from my case as the person who's written it, it's not just a matter of degree and a local flavor, as we said before. Hopefully it goes beyond that.
I just wanted to say something very quickly related to this, and then Professor Rukmini has a question, I believe. What you were saying just now made me think of the term real post-coloniality that you use in the chapter about Mahashweta Devi's works. Do you mean that in the sense of not humanist post-coloniality? Is that what you were talking about right now?
Yeah. It's having sent off the manuscript so long ago now. It's hard to really recall when I said that, but it does ring some bells in my head. I think, yes, exactly that. I mean, I really do strongly believe that, at least within literary studies, which is what I know very well, at least within literary studies, any post-colonial critique, like worthy of the name, should not limit itself to the human. And that the question of colonialism, which is still ongoing and is still animating aesthetic works, that question necessitates a real intervention and reckoning with the more than human sense of what colonialism was. So when in that chapter I say those words, a real post-coloniality, the real there is exactly that, this I think necessary acceptance that we need to understand the central place of the human. Of course, I'm not getting rid of the human. I'm not a post-humanist in that way. Holding on to the human, but seeing the human's relationship with animals. That's what I'm calling for there.
Thank you. Professor Rukmini, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. Hi. I want to apologize at the outset because I only got the book a couple of hours ago. So many of my questions are off the conversation and just scanning, looking at the book. And they're really footnotes to Susan's and Anu's questions about the theory and the post-colonial. So I have a very set of naive questions. The first one is how much the kind of theoretical apparatus you are using translates into other contexts. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. For example, I was thinking of this word creaturely, L-Y, which is, of course, likeness and could mean a likeness as well. And this notion of a likeness is obviously related to literature, but before we come to that, I was thinking about how it might translate into Mahashweta Devi's language, for example. So I was translating it, and what it would be something like Janvar Jaise or Janvar Mutun or whatever, Prani Mutun, which means like a creature. And like a creature doesn't actually, would not make sense. So I was thinking of what works in language in English, to transfer it in a way that it makes sense to the writers whom you analyze, or the post-colonial peoples all over the world who operate with a different kind of conceptual apparatus, would be problematic, because I understand this notion of likeness in English, but when you translate it it means something like being like an animal. Now, and no, all of us are both beings who are animals, because human beings are animals, and all of so it applies to animals. We are all being like an animal. So I'm confused about, how these notions would actually make sense to a reader who might have access to your translated text, but would not have access to your world of concepts. So that's the first type of question. It's a naive question because I haven't read your book. And even if I had read your book, it's quite likely that I wouldn't quite get it, but I'm struggling. And the second thing I wanted to ask about is I'm working on the evolution of writing. That writing, human history is maybe, at least between 1 million and 50,000 years ago. And writing, so people were talking around 50,000 years. We know from various types of evidence that we have, which I won't go into. But writing only came in the last 5,000 years. So it's a very recent form. So I've been looking at the prehistory of writing, and the prehistory of writing we get from, let's say, representations on cave surfaces and so on. And this is way before even Marxian sort of primitive accumulation, because
Yes.
it was a long time ago.
Yes, a long time ago.
A long time ago,
Yes.
but people were still thinking about their relationship to their animality and representing weapons, and always, almost in all the drawings that we've seen, the animal is much larger than the human being, but it is a kind of occupying the same representational space. So, the same stone wall, but there's a kind of separation and a kind of likeness. So there is representation of the relationship to the animal world very early on, and as part of our prehistory, long before writing. So when it comes to writing now, and you're talking about how writers may how writers may represent or understand this relationship between themselves and the animals. I have a particular question with regard to mythology and Mahashweta Devi. I have many questions, including about Marx, but especially about Mahashweta Devi. Mahashweta Devi talks about the pterodactyl. She does not talk about the various mythical forms that you have in the literature. So she uses a modern scientific animal rather than a mythological animal, and that one is seen by a child, not by an adult. My question really is the notion of myth, as in centaurs and hydras and lots of Indian creatures as well. That notion of myth which you deploy in your work, how is it different from myth, our interpretation of myth, where there's not a specific word for myth at all? So what is mythology for you in the writer's world? Because you use the word myth, I think, in your chapter on Mahashweta Devi. But what does it mean?
Wow, amazing questions. Thank you so much, Rukmini. Okay, well, I'll start with the second question, if that's okay, because it's fresh. So, your research into the evolution of writing sounds really interesting. And I mean, in a sort of past life, before embarking on a PhD, I did quite a bit of work on on cave paintings and cave drawings, not from an anthropological perspective, but from a kind of aesthetic perspective. And, you know, I think that what differentiates for me what I'm doing in this book from that kind of pre-evolutionary, whatever you want to say, or pre-modern sense of
prehistorical, let's say, prehistoric,
prehistoric aesthetics, is that I'm interested in the institution of writing, not writing in general, because I think that, you know, numerous anthropologists have said, for example, the Chauvet caves, that's writing, right? That the depiction, that the paintings are a form of writing. So I'm not trying to create a deep history of writing which stretches back and hence has something to say about the human condition and its kind of basic elemental relationship with animal life, because I am looking at quite, you know, in terms of what I'm looking at, it's such a small subset of a subset of a subset of a subset of what writing is. I'm interested in writing in the sense that literature is a modern institution, as in the literary, as being this modern art form in the wake of the novel as the kind of paradigmatic traveling form for what it means to write prose. And so it's within that particular genre, mode, and thing that's circulating, that is the kind of real specific point in which I narrow down and chose 3 authors, right? So so yeah, I'm looking at literature as a modern institution. There is, of course, been literatures which have existed for longer, but I'm interested in a kind of capital L literature. And then, so the second part of your kind of comment and question on that second one was about the pterodactyl, right? And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's such an astonishing text where you would, you know, you are tripped up by the use of the pterodactyl, this scientifically validated specimen, as opposed to something mythological. And yet, the text, it's not me who says that it's myth. It is in the text itself. The text says that the pterodactyl appears as myth to a character. So,
is it a translation? Do you know whether the word myth, which is used in the text you used, which is presumably an English text?
Yeah. So this is
text. This
is original. Yeah. This is a translation I'm working with, but it was translated by Spivak, right, in the 90s, and one of the kind of methods that Spivak uses and talks about in the introduction to the collection of works, which she calls imaginary maps. She says that Spivak says that when she is going to use a English loanword from the original, it will be italicized in her English translation. And myth is one of those italicized words. So it tells the reader that in the Bengali, it appears as the English word myth. So it has these layers of like strange transliteration, right? Where it's a traveling concept to begin with. So it's not me who's saying that it's myth. It's actually in the text itself.
It's just difficult because the city-educated journalist comes into this world with his vocabulary of myth, for which there is no local equivalent. No. And Spivak, like you and me, are plugged into the capitalist modes of production, and so they're Janus-based, they're addressing to audiences, which means that the onus is on people like you to understand the notion of the myth, not only in your terms, but in the, I don't know, I mean, I'm just confused because myth, I can't find a parallel to it in all the Indian lexicon. So when Spivak uses myth, and myth is attributed to this journalist, then there's something quite complicated going on in conceptual terms. And I just am puzzled about how to understand it. So it's not you that I'm kind of laying this onus on. It's all of us. And that's just a worry. I mean, it's not something you can resolve.
No, no. If I could, but I can't. But that question of the untranslatable takes us to your first question, which was about the applicability of the creaturely as a epistemically specific word to context which it did not arise from, context which it has not yet traveled to. So to what extent is this a, I mean, the critique that is implied by your question, right? I don't want to put that in your mouth, but the one which is implied is that it is some sort of projection on my part, right? As the critic. Yeah, right. And I'm cognizant of that as a potential problem here. I mean, one of the things that I do in the introduction, I give a genealogy of the concept of the creaturely. So that genealogy is an attempt to really pinpoint its epistemic origins, it's the way it's traveled, so that then I can be clear with the reader about my own projections, my own limits. So I've presented it in an honest way, that is one in which, yeah, okay, maybe there is something untranslatable and impossibly unapplicable to these texts from elsewhere. But one of the kind of gambles that I make in the book is that by taking it into fields that it might not easily translate, we do see something novel, something new. And that if there is some sort of small violence going on in that move that I do, then it might be worth it for what comes out the other side in terms of the critical insights or scholarly insights. So that's one of the moves I make. And it's interesting because you were talking there about what would happen were you to try and translate the creaturely into, I mean, you were saying it was Janwa. I mean, for my sins of whatever, I mean, I've been trying to learn Hindi recently. I've been learning for over a year. So that is in a sense part of a response to the limits of the book, in that I've actually tried, in the wake of having finished the manuscript, to deepen my engagement with these kinds of texts and questions, so that I can get closer. So I see this book as part of a larger engagement, not the end of a story. And I'm trying to be honest as a researcher about my limits, and then also work to get past them in some ways. But what is interesting is that you talked about when you translated it and you came up with this sense of it is like animals, and it doesn't really scan or gloss in this context. Well, that may be the case, but one of the things that I try and do in the book is to say that the creaturely for me doesn't just stand as something redemptive. It doesn't stand as something that can save literature or human-animal relations. You know, there's a sense that blurring the lines between human and the animal via the creaturely is something recuperative or redemptive. That is one argument I might make at some points in the book. But what I'm also interested in throughout it is how the creaturely is a kind of negative affliction or abjection, or something that is taken as likeness with animals. And in all of the authors I look at, those two senses of it as being something potentially redemptive, but also something that is abject or precarious or vulnerable, both are in operation at the same time. So to talk about someone being like an animal in that kind of negative way, that is happening at the level of the text as well. So I don't simply use the term to try and create some sort of new subject, some neither human nor animal. Instead, it is an affliction in some cases to be like an animal, and I'm cognizant of that too. Thank you very much for your questions. They were fabulous.
Jian, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, thank you. I just saw a notice of your talk, and so I thought I must be here. And so I definitely am going to, if I didn't even have a chance to glance at your book, but I certainly want to. Anyway, I just think about how the way the term the war against animals is increasingly being used when one thinks about extinction. And I was reminded of this chapter, and I'll put it in the chat in this, and I'm sure you know it. Here, let me just put this in the chat here for everyone. This chapter, The Roots of the Sixth Mass Extinction. And Julie Andrzejewski makes an argument that we shouldn't use the word extinction, but extermination. And I was at one conference long ago in 2016, where a group of scholars from Australia, and I have to dig out my notes there, were making a very strong case that we have to stop normalizing extinction by looking at specifically the role of capitalism and so on. And so I just think, I'm going to benefit from reading your book, which is about looking at this in another way. I mean, about the heteronormativity of, assuming humans as the kind of center. And Susan and Anu know that I'm really interested in stray street free-ranging dogs. And this, your book, I think, is going to give me a way of kind of thinking about this too. And so I guess I just wanted to kind of thank you. I teach a class called Animal Planet, and I'm teaching now in another class, but I'm using bits of it for the Animal Planet. Of course, Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse. And I really like what you said about how post-colonial studies, post-colonial critique should not limit itself only to the human, and how Ghosh is such an example of that. And so all of this is just by way of sort of commenting on how much I've learned from your talk, and you're making me think of all these other kinds of connections. So not a question there, but just a kind of commentary and expression of gratitude.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if your name's pronounced Jean or Jian, but thank you so much. And
it depends on if you're French, it's Jean, and I pretend to say Jean, and my family calls me Jeannie or Jean. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, you raise an interesting point about extinction, and it's actually since working on the manuscript, it is the concept of extinction that I've been most deeply involved with the past couple of years. And I have a special issue of Environmental Humanities coming out maybe later this year, maybe early next year, which is about extinction. It's about extinction studies, multi-species studies, and is kind of pitched as a bit of a comradely critique of some of the stuff that's going on there, where I do think that it is incredibly useful what extinction studies are doing, and they are mostly an Australian group of scholars. So they might be the people you're talking about. I'm not sure, but there is within the humanities, but also within the scientific literature, lots of preference of talking about extermination, as you said, and then in another few sources, the sixth mass extinction is referred to as biological annihilation, and I think that is incredibly useful to an extent, but I also think that the term extinction is not wholly tarnished by its polysemous tradition and meanings. I think that the rejection of the term extinction to court, like totally, would forsake a lot of advantages and scientific tradition that is useful for grappling with what's going on. I mean, this is why people try and talk about, you know, they get themselves in all kinds of knots talking about anthropological extinction or anthropo extinction. And then suddenly you get into the same critique that people leverage at the Anthropocene, where it's like, well, which humans, you know, which humans are really doing this? So can you really say that all humans are? So there is a conceptual difficulty around this stuff. And whether you go for one side or the other, you're going to encounter problems. I mean, you know, in the same way that we were talking about the limits of Marxism earlier, like I do think that I kind of go back to the kind of provincializing Europe, Dipesh Chakrabarty stuff. You know, it's like, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, just because it came from the Enlightenment doesn't mean that we ought to junk it. There are dialectically, there are things that we should let go, but there are things that we should take up. And so I think the extinction as a concept is not something we should just let go. There are aspects of it, elements of it that we could reconcile and let go of, but others that we do need to hold on to, because otherwise we don't have a science to actually assess what's going on, and we do need that. We do need data, for example. So yeah, it's a great comment, and it did get me thinking.
We've almost run out of time, but Dominic, could you take a last question?
Of course, I would take a couple more. I'm enjoying myself.
All right. So you use the term asymptotic planetary alongsideness. It seems to me a very useful tool to perceive the literary and real world networks in which the human, the inhuman, as you call it, and the non-human exist as actors without negating or reducing their respective histories, their trajectories and interests, and also without hybridizing. So I was just wondering if this alongsideness is different from entanglement, and how.
Yeah, and it is. You've definitely picked up on something there. So yeah, I mean, okay, the kind of backstory to this is a kind of analytic frustration I have with the concept of entanglement, that as I perceive it, it too quickly negates difference, and I've seen it, for me, it's not just like in the big work of Haraway and Anand Singh, but is also, I see it on the ground among, you know, all the people, many of my peers who I love and adore, but, you know, take this concept and it's so enabling that I feel like it has some problems, right? When things are so enabling, so easy to use, I think, you know, you've got to take a second look. And a friend of mine, Eva Giraud, just published this book called What Comes After Entanglement with Duke University Press, and that's a good critique of entanglement discourses. And yeah, as you point to, at the end of my chapter on Maheshwara Devi, I try and think about a different way of conceiving relationality without entanglement. And I come up with this. Well, I take the term alongsideness. Actually, it is referenced. It's from a work by Joanna Latimer, and that's referenced in the book for anyone who has a PDF or anything. So you'll see that. And alongsideness is deliberately conceived as a difference preserving category, that we may exist alongside one another, but there is some sort of gap, right? That we are not totally enmeshed. And I think just conceptually, right, even though, you know, biologically we know that, of course, organisms share all these different aspects, even though biologically it might not be the case, conceptually, analytically, I do not want to give up these distinctions. I think distinctions are important, no matter what the kind of hybridity discourse will say. And so I also think then in this case, it becomes a really, really productive way of reading what is going on in that story, that short novel, however you want to call it, indeterminate prose text, Pterodactyl by Maheshwata Devi, where the two characters do not become one, their worldviews aren't reconciled, they're not friends, you know, the struggles of both of them are not like overcome, that, you know, there is an ambiguity to the ending of the book. And yet all of these things which trouble, which complicate any neat narrative outcome, even though that's the case, there is still some sort of hope, some sort of togetherness. And I think alongsideness is a way of conceiving that, in that there is something shared, even though it's not identity, it's not identical. There is still something shared. So yeah, that's where alongsideness comes from. And I've just enjoyed the past 2 minutes of talking about it. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you. And I think Professor Rukmini has another question.
Well, it's not a question, it's an apology, because I went off, my lights went off and they've just come back. So I didn't hear a lot of the answer to the last question, which I was really interested in. So if you have a recording, I will listen to that. I just wanted to apologize for not being there, for being cast out to the margins. I wondered, one thing I did wonder about, with Marx, there's so much literature on and as you said, Marx constantly has to be updated, revised in conversation with modernity and so on and so forth. I wanted to ask whether, these old Marxist concepts like false consciousness, and they were passé in this kind of world where we are talking about modernity as ceaseless production of nominal kinds, whether it's artillery or books or whatever, that the notion of false consciousness implies that there's a real consciousness. There's some kind of non-false consciousness, if not real. So I'm wondering whether some Marxist notions need to be maybe re-examined or even perhaps jettisoned in your view. Now, false consciousness is a very, very like entanglement, which I'm always warning Susan against, is one of those concepts which is very attractive because it's so available. And yet, would you say that it's incompatible with this frame that you're looking at, with the modern novel and so on? So I just wondered.
It sounds like it's something that you've been thinking quite lively about, and if you have any reading recommendations or anything on that question, then send them over to me later. I would love to engage with them. But I mean, it's funny because in a sense I feel like false consciousness is so out of fashion right now.
It's totally out of fashion.
But it almost that out of fashionness almost makes me want to go back to it. It makes me want to say that there's something useful here. I mean, it has become known by different names in a way, euphemistically. But yeah, I mean, I don't know about its relationship to this book project, to the book. I've not thought about the relationship, but when I say it's been known around under different names, I mean, there is a sense that the kind of classic Jamesonian, Frederick Jameson's analysis, the political unconscious, there is the sense in which there is some relation. He doesn't talk about, as far as I can remember, false consciousness, but they are not unrelated concepts. The political unconscious and false consciousness, they're not unrelated concepts. I don't think that. I mean, obviously, in its kind of most simplistic version, then we might jettison that version of false consciousness, its most simplistic, vulgar iteration. But there are, I'm sure, incredibly sophisticated versions of it out there that are quite convincing, and I'm happy to be convinced by them if they're out there. I don't know. Is it something that you've been thinking about?
Yeah, I have, simply because, there's a sort of an assumption that there's lots that's invisible to us, and in literary writing or various kinds of writing, those invisible things about our relationship to the environment come into, into our field of vision, in literature or something, which are normally invisibilized in our everyday normative, grounded discourse. And so in that sense, I don't know whether, as you said, false consciousness may be too clunky an idea to use directly, but it seems to be built into these kinds of discourses about our relationship with animals and what we can see and not see about modes of production and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think I have been thinking about it. Yeah. Not yet writing about it, but certainly thinking about it. So
There is the sense throughout the book. One of the things that I'm trying to do is point out, is to explore, and also interpret those ways in which literary works do notice what is happening in those modes of production, and that point that literature can notice something that is completely ordinary, but to the subject who is living their daily life under that mode of production is rendered like on the margins, on the peripheries, outside of vision, is not something you think about because you have to go about your daily life. So literature can engage those things, right? So the I mean, if anyone's familiar with the work of J.M. Coetzee and like the Lives of Animals lectures and stuff like that.
I'm familiar with him, very familiar. And he wrote the little tag for my novel, the only one I've ever written. I'll send that to you. That would be
amazing.
So one of the things that I really feel is animals creep into my work, into my poetry and novels, even when I don't want them to. And so kind of part of the margins and so that's why I thought, in our everyday life, we live in a particular mode of consciousness. And then in literature, you may these holes which appear whether you're writing or not, which to me seems like they are about the types of consciousness engendered by writing or literature. I may be wrong about this because I haven't theorized it enough.
No, it's a marvelous thought that even when you're not thinking about them, they're thinking about you in some way.
Exactly. That's what yeah, that was my thought. Thank you for catching it.
No worries.
That's the moment then to reiterate the idea of alongsideness. They're alongside. There's no getting away from them, whether you want them or you don't.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dominic, for joining us today. I'm afraid we won't have time for more questions tonight, but it was great talking to you about your book. Obviously had the opportunity to read it before this session, and I hope the others managed to get their hands on a copy soon too. Thanks a lot and have a great evening.
Thank you very much. It's absolutely brilliant to be here and meet all of you.